Hi and welcome to this new lecture on African political systems. Today we're going to speak about another very important topic in African politics, which is the role of the military in African politics and civil-military relations, and how these civil-military relations were transformed in the last decade, or the last 2 decades actually, with democratization in Africa. And here we need to speak about a number of points. We will cover most of them today, and we will leave the last point to the next lecture. So we'll start with the major trends. How many coups did Africa witness in the last 6 decades or so since independence? Which region, for instance, witnessed more coups than others, and so on. And then we are going to focus on why we have been witnessing all these coups in Africa. So Africa is known to be the continent of military coups, right? Although it's not particular to Africa. You may know, for instance, that, well, in other continents, in Latin America, for instance, we have also a high number of coups that declined with democratization, which is more or less the same in Africa. So we have commonalities with other regions in the global south. And then we will move to another important point, which is sometimes confusing to many students. How do we define a military regime, right? When do we say that this regime is more military than civilian, right? So we have a number of suggested criteria according to which we can judge this. We will then move to speaking about military policies. So when the military dominated African politics, or at least many African countries, or 2/3 to be specific, 2/3 of African countries, in the period from the end of the 1950s to almost the end of the 1980s. How did they rule actually? Did they perform better or worse than civilian regimes? And then we will add a note on how did the military withdraw from politics when the wave of democratization happened in the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 90s. And next time we'll be speaking about what happened in the last 2-3 decades after the transformation to democratization. Have, at least, major countries like Nigeria, for instance, which witnessed a dominant role of the military in politics since independence, did they manage actually to transform these civil-military relations and move from what we can call military control to civilian control? And is the Western paradigm of civilian control relevant to Africa or not? So to start with, if we look at the major trends of military coups in Africa in the last 5-6 decades, or the period after independence, we will find that Africa witnessed a wave of military coups in the 2 decades after independence, in the 60s and 70s. And that was quite dominant in many parts of Africa, so that more than 1/3 of sub-Saharan African countries witnessed coups in this period. So major countries in West Africa like Ghana, Nigeria, or even other countries in other regions like Uganda or Rwanda, all these countries witnessed military coups. And many of these countries, the first leader after independence, although, as we said before, this was the first generation of charismatic intellectual leaders, they actually were overthrown by military coups. In the period from the mid-50s until the end of the 90s, African countries witnessed about 80 successful military coups and more than 100 failed coups or a coup attempt. And of course, I guess you know the difference between the three, right? So when we speak about a successful military coup, that's a coup that actually end with the military dominating politics, right? With the military ruling directly or indirectly, as we will see later. But when we speak about a failed coup, that's a coup that was staged, but then the civilian leaders were able to defeat it and return to power very quickly. When we speak about coup plus, these are of course only at the stage of preparation or design or what have you, but they are not actually staged. They are not even implemented. They just stop at the level of preparation or plotting. And of course, you can guess that this relates to the question of leadership that we discussed last time, right? Because it was only in few cases, in exceptional cases, that first leaders after independence, these charismatic leaders, left power voluntarily and thus were not overthrown by military coup. So in case of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, that we mentioned before, we mentioned him when we spoke about, ideology and the idea of Ujama and so on, he left power voluntarily. The same for another intellectual, Leopold Senghor in Senegal, West Africa, and also leaders like Ahmadou Ahidjo in Cameroon. But unfortunately, many of these first generation of leaders, other leaders in other countries actually, stayed in power until they were overthrown by their armies. It was also noted among these general trends on coups in Africa that once a coup is staged, there is, and it's actually successful, there will be a high probability or high likelihoods of counter coups. So that many countries, especially in West Africa, saw itself actually going into this vicious circles of coups and counter coups in very short periods of time. So in a country like Benin, a small country in West Africa, in only 10 years or less than 10 years, 6 coups and counter coups were actually staged. Nigeria the same, although in a longer period of time. So from the first coup in January 66 until the last coup in Nigeria in 1993, Nigeria witnessed 6 successful coups and 2 failed coups. Right? So, and this is, I think, very normal and intuitive, right? Once a senior military officer stage a coup and is able to dominate and rule, so this will give a signal or an incentive to other leaders in the same army to stage a counter coup and also seek to dominate. Another fact to highlight is that all African regions experience coups, and you have to be accurate here. I'm saying all African regions, not all African countries. Huh? So all African regions experience coups. That's why we're giving examples from different countries, right? From North Africa, right, to West Africa, which witnessed the largest number of coups, or more coups than other regions, but also East Africa, so Ethiopia, for instance, to Southern Africa, either successful or unsuccessful coups, or again countries like Angola or Mozambique, seeing no successful coups, but at least they witnessed some sort of coup. So all African regions experience coups, but West Africa experienced more coups in this period. We're speaking about the period again from the mid-1950s until the 1990s. Almost a third of African countries have never experienced coups or coup attempts, which raise the interesting question of why, right? So in countries like South Africa or Namibia or Botswana or Mauritius, these countries witnessed no coups or coups attempt at all. So these countries have not experienced the army staging a coup or trying to dominate politics, right? In other cases, there were coups but they were never successful, which also raised the question of why. Why coups in Senegal or Kenya or Tanzania or Cameroon or Angola or Mozambique never succeeded? Okay, and we'll come to this question later on. But a very interesting trend in the last 2 decades, and we'll come to this in some details later when we speak about democracy in a couple of weeks or so, is the sharp decline in the number of coups in Africa in the last 2 decades. Uh, of course, one reason is, as I've just mentioned, democratization, but the other reason is that, well, uh, in general, coups are no longer, tolerated regionally and internationally. And this does not mean that, well, the military is totally out of politics in African politics, right? Because as we will see later, the definition of military regime, depends on many criteria. We'll come to that later. But at least, staging a coup against a civilian leader, whatever the nature of this leader is no longer tolerated by international powers and by regional organizations. So in Africa, we will find that the African Union, the continental organization, decided when it put its constituted act to totally abandon or to totally outlaw the phenomena of coups and to suspend the country in which a coup was staged until the civilian rule is restored. And this happened, so the African Union more recently, and you may have been following that in the last few months, when a revolution started in Sudan in December 2018, and this pushed the military to overthrow Omar al-Bashir from power. The African Union actually suspended Sudan immediately until the military council and the civilian leaders of the revolution agreed on some sort of co-management or co-ruling of the transitional period. Right. The same happened in Burkina Faso a few years ago, when in 2015 again a popular uprising started, but then the military used the opportunity of this popular uprising to overthrow the president. So again here, Burkina Faso was suspended immediately from the African Union, until power was handed to a civilian transitional government. So if these are the major trends, and if military coups, have been a central character of African politics in the 4 or 5 years after independence, and they have been in decline, it then raises the question of why. Why Africa has been witnessing all, these numbers of coups in the last decades. Theoretically speaking, the major literature on civil-military relations, and of course you can read on that and in the classic literature written by Samuel Huntington and many other scholars on the role of military in politics in Western democracies and in countries of the global South. They basically refer to 3 major trends or schools of thought. The first school of thought looks at the environment, the social environment, or what we call the the political, cultural, and economic and social reasons, which may relate to political culture that is vulnerable to military intervention or receptive to military intervention in politics. So in a certain country, people may actually believe that, well, the role of the military is not only protecting the country's border, but that the military is welcome to play a role beyond that. Also, weak political institutions and civil forces. So when we have weak civil society organizations and political parties in particular, so this obviously paved the way to the intervention of the military in politics, right? And of course, economic and social problems. So if we have an economic crisis that is, forcing burdens on ordinary citizens, or problems of social cohesion and ethnic divisions, which is very dominant in Africa, as we will see in a minute. So all these problems in the political and social and economic environment can actually encourage the military to intervene in politics. On the other hand, we have scholars who look more into the culture of the military as an institution. Right? So they look at how the military is organized, how recruitment and training and discipline, happen inside this institution. Are military officers actually trained on military professionalism and non-intervention in politics, or are they trained, to this principles of what we call the heroic posture, that they have a role, that military officers have a role as a savior of the nation in any moment of crisis, that they have to intervene if the national identity or the social cohesion or the territorial integrity of the country is actually threatened. And between the two, we have schools of thought that actually combine different elements, right? So Rock, for instance, is referring to the fact that, well, whatever the political background to a coup, when the army acts, it generally acts for army reasons in addition to any other it may espouse, i.e., that, well, we have many variables, maybe the most important of which is the interest of the military as an institution. So whenever the interests of the army are actually threatened, so the army here will intervene. It's not about, any other factors in the environment or what have you. It's about the interest of the army being threatened. Or Samuel Decalo, who is referring to both corporate and personal motivation. And by corporate here, again, we mean the interest of the army as an institution. Or maybe it's the aspiration of a certain military officer, senior or a junior military officer, his aspirations to play a political role that actually induce him to mobilize other military officers in the army to stage a coup. So it may be as easy as just a single person being, aspiring for leadership, for political leadership. Now, if you apply this to Africa, these different explanations and interpretations of military coups to Africa, we will find that we have different reasons, different similar reasons. So the political factors include divisions between political elites. So we may have competing political elites, like the case of Congo-Kinshasa, for instance, with Zaire. We mentioned the example of Mobutu before, who ruled Congo-Kinshasa from the mid-1960s into the mid-1990s. And Mobutu came to power through a military coup. Yes, supported by external forces, and we'll come to the element of external support or lack of support afterwards. But the main reason for staging a coup here was the divisions between political and military elites. Political factors may also include the weakness of political institutions. As we said, we mentioned before how the one-party system was so weak that it actually led to the predominance of other forces, including the military or leadership or what have you. But when you have a central institution that is actually weak, so this allow other institutions to take over. And then the ideological factor is also important. We'll see that in some examples. But sometimes the leadership is maybe adopting an ideology that is very different from what certain senior military officers in the military are actually adopting, and this facilitate the staging of the coup. We have also economic factors, and these factors relate to the nature of the post-colonial African economies. Remember when we spoke about the seeds of neocolonialism and how the economies of many African countries were actually dependent on a single crop or cash crop or a single mineral resource, and thus the budget of this or that country would be badly affected if the prices of these crops or primary commodities or mineral resources or what have you fluctuated in international markets, how this crisis can actually lead to changes in government and to military intervention. So just to give an example, in Nigeria, for instance, in 1983, the overthrow of Shagari was linked to the drop in oil prices. We will see later, for instance, even in countries like Ghana, not an oil producing country, economic crisis and mismanagement also contributed to the coup of 1966 that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. The third types of factors are social factors, and these are here kind of a mix between social and political factors, because it's basically related to the politicization of ethnicity that we mentioned before. The fact that there may be a single ethnic group that is dominating power and wealth, and thus coups are staged in order to end the domination of this ethnicity. This happened in Ethiopia in 1974 coup or revolution or what have you. We'll come to this dilemma of coups and revolutions and so on when we speak about reforming civil-military relations. But anyway, the movement in 1974 in Ethiopia, the changing government, whatever we call it, was basically targeting the end of the Amharic domination. So historically, Imperial Ethiopia or Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie and before him Menelik were basically dominated by the Amhara. And the 1974 coup came to end this domination, although it simply changed the domination of one ethnic group, changed the system from the domination of one ethnic group to the other. But in any case, the reason was the historical domination of one nationality and the marginalization of others. But we have to make it clear that in many cases we have often various reasons for a single coup. So you do not have a single reason for a single coup, and even if coups are happening in the same country, you will have different reasons for different coups happening in the same countries, even in the same year. So the coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana in 1966, for instance, had many reasons, including, as I mentioned before, the economic crisis and mismanagement, but also the fact that Kwame Nkrumah gave more power to his presidential guards, which gave a signal of threat to the army. So the army or the military felt that it is being overpowered by the presidential guards, so and that the privileges are being actually threatened. And there was also this ideological difference between Kwame Nkrumah, who was, as we said before, a very progressive, anti-Western, Pan-African leader, and many senior military officers who saw that, well, his ideas were very much impractical or not in line with the thinking of these military officers. In Nigeria, and as we said, in Nigerian politics, the question of ethnicity and the division between the three major ethnic groups that we mentioned before is the central feature of Nigerian politics. So ethnically based conflicts were more evident as a reason for coups in Nigeria. The desire to end the domination of the North was a reason for the January 1966, which was seen as an Igbo coup, a coup staged by the Igbo to end the domination of the Yoruba in the North. And the July 1966 coup, so we had two coups in the same years in Nigeria. The first was to end the domination of the North, and the second, as you can guess, was an attempt to regain the dominance of the North. But in both cases, as you can see, the ethnic factor was clear. Now I think it's interesting not to mention only why we witnessed coup in coup states, but also to think why certain countries did not witness coups. And it's interesting here to make the point that, well, the absence of coups does not necessarily mean that there is a civilian or a democratic control, right? So in only a handful of countries, in only few countries, the absence of coups can be attributed to strong institutions and to democratic values and so on. So if you look at countries like Botswana again, which we mentioned a few times before, that is a bit exceptional in Africa, that it witnessed, multi-partyism, for instance, from independence until now, regardless of the lack of alternation of power. But at the end of the day, we had a sustainable multi-party system and a more developed economy. So we can say that in examples like Botswana or in South Africa after 1994, for instance, we have been witnessing, strong democratic institutions and democratic values and so on that prevented any military takeover. But in other countries, the lack of coups or lack of successful coups, because as I said, in a country like Kenya, we had a coup attempt in the 80s, but it was not successful. So the fact that we did not witness coups or successful coups in other cases can be attributed simply to the skills of leaders that can share the spoil of the regime or of the state, i.e. state resources with the military, i.e. simply to keep the military happy, to keep it loyal to the president. And this does not mean that the military does not have power. To the contrary, maybe the military here is playing some sort of political power by supporting the president, for instance. So if, as we will see later, if the main support base of the president is coming from the military, so this means that, well, the regime is maybe more military than civilian, right? So again, I'm just making the point that, well, it may not be the case that the absence of coups means that we have strong institutions, strong democratic institutions, because the reason may be simply that the leader is skillful enough to share state resources with the military or to keep the military loyal or happy. Other reasons for the lack of coups or the absence of coups may be the preoccupation with more extreme forms of political violence. So in countries that witnessed civil wars just after independence, like Mozambique and Angola, there was simply no army to stage a coup. So you remember that, well, Angola and Mozambique were under Portuguese colonialism, and that these countries actually waged armed struggle against this colonialism. And in both countries we had different armed groups fighting the Portuguese colonial power. And after gaining independence in the mid-1970s, these different armed groups started fighting each other to control power. So there was no such a central state with a strong army to be fighted or to stage a coup in the first place, right? So this is a very simple reason for why Angola and Mozambique did not witness a coup, because for a long time after independence they were busy with a civil war. In the case of Ethiopia, for instance, or in the case of Eritrea, because it was Eritrea that did not witness a military coup since it gained its independence or declared its independence in 1993, the reason that is often mentioned for the absence of coups in Eritrea is its war with Ethiopia. So we know Eritrea was independent. I mean, historically it was independent, but Ethiopia, Imperial Ethiopia, which, as we mentioned before, depended on expansionism, annexing parts of Somalia and annexing Eritrea or dominating Eritrea. This historical animosity or conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea ended in 1993 when Eritrea declared its independence. But just shortly after independence, Eritrea 1998 started a border war with Ethiopia that lasted a few years. So again, Eritrea, with this constant tension with Ethiopia, was busy with foreign domination, with fighting and struggling foreign domination, in such a case with Ethiopia, and that's why the army or the military was again busy with another big cause, which is, as we said, fighting another country, enabling country. A fourth category, which is also very interesting, is this category of countries that actually never witnessed coups because they were basically, or the regimes in these countries, the presidents in these countries were supported by external foreign power, external or foreign power, right? So in French ex-colonies or Francophone countries that had strong ties with France, countries like Cameroon or Gabon or Senegal, leaders in these countries were very much supported and backed by France, so that, you know, this actually deterred the military from staging any coup, because the military will, in its calculation, it will actually have in mind that if they try to stage a coup, they will be defeated not by the president himself, but by France, right? In other cases, however, France supported when, you know, it felt that the current or the incumbent regime is not working in its favor. It actually supported military coups, and this happened in a country like Central African Republic in 1979. So, as you can guess, when we speak about the role of external powers here, it is not fixed, it's not constant. It all depends on how this power defines its interests. So, as we said before in the case of Congo-Kinshasa, when the whatever foreign power is actually in line and can see that the incumbent regime is serving its interests, so it will protect it against coups. If not, it will support the military, it will support coups against this leadership. So these different reasons for the lack or the absence of coups in non-coup states lead us to then four models of civil-military relations in Africa, right? We have on the other, on part of this, of the continuum, we have countries that enjoy civilian democratic control, i.e. we have here strong democratic institutions, strong democratic values, and of course by democratic institutions we mean, parliaments and judiciary and constitutions and, political parties and what have you, that actually support the alternation of power by only peaceful means, by democratic means. And we have also a professional military that respects democratic principles, that respects democratic rules, and thus do not interfere in politics. And this is the case of countries like Botswana, Mauritius, the exceptional countries in Africa, but also countries like South Africa and to some extent Tanzania. We have the second model, which is the model of the external guarantor, an external power that actually protects the current regime and thus, or the current leader, and thus this leader cannot be overthrown by a military coup, right? And this happens in countries, especially in countries where we have foreign military bases. So Senegal hosts a big French military base. Djibouti, we mentioned before that this tiny country in East Africa is actually hosting many foreign military bases, right? Including a French base, an American base, but also a Chinese base. And this means that all these countries, especially France, since Djibouti was a French colony, all these countries have, an interest in keeping this country stable, and thus in supporting its leadership, as long as this leader is actually, securing this military base to all these countries, So if you have a foreign military base, or maybe some sort of military collaboration, so it doesn't have to be a military base, but at least some sort of strong political and military cooperation between whatever external party and this country, right? In countries like Togo, for instance, or Cameroon, who do not have military bases as such, such, but we have close relationship between, you know, the political elite in Cameroon. And so in Cameroon, for instance, we have a president who is one of the longest serving presidents in Africa, President Paul Biya. I think he has been in power for more than 3 decades, right? And again, I mean, his close connections to the French guarantee his stay in power and his long, you know, duration in power. The same for Togo. So in Togo, power was actually transferred from Iyadima the father to Iyadima the son, and both are close allies to the French, right? So especially France, I mean, has a big role in this game of protecting certain elites and preventing military, coups against these elites. The third model is a model of clientelistic relationship between the civilian leader and the army. And by now, of course, you know what we mean by clientelism, right? It's the fact that you're offering certain benefits and privileges to the army as an institution or to certain army officers. So it may not be privileges to the army as an institution in terms of, you know, offering them, for instance, good services, good health services or housing or what have you, which is evident in some countries, but it may be the case that you're offering privileges to the most important army officers who can mobilize, you know, other junior officers to stage a coup, right? In some of these countries, you may also have appointment based on ethnicity, as is the case in Kenya, for instance. So the president may be, you know, related or linked to a certain ethnicity. In the case of Kenya, the Kikuyu, for instance. So you make sure that most of the senior army officers are from the same ethnicity, right? So that you can be also protected. Okay. So this is the third model, that you're offering privileges in order to ensure loyalty. And of course, the fourth and the last model is the opposite of civilian control, which is the military control, that you have a central role for the army in politics, you know, either ruling directly, which has become, as we said, very much outdated. You know, no military is ruling directly now. It may be ruling indirectly through, as we will see later, establishing political parties or holding elections, and then the military leader would win elections. But this does not mean that it, as we will see later, that is switching the regime automatically from being military to being civilian, or sustaining the regime, right? It may be the case that, yes, it's not ruling directly, but it is the main source of the regime's legitimacy or support. And in this model, you do not have checks. You do not have democratic checks on military policies. So there are no democratic, accountability on the military recruitment, for instance, or budget of the military, or the military deals, you know, arms deals with other countries. All these things: recruitment, appointments, promotion, retirement, military deals or arms sales, all these are actually not subject to parliamentary oversight or parliamentary or democratic checks. And that's what the case, obviously, of Nigeria before 1999, and we will see in the next lecture that Nigeria, after its democratic transformation in 1999, has been trying to introduce some changes, some of which are actually successful and others are unsuccessful. As you can see, we have some sort of a continuum. On the one hand, or at the one end of this continuum, we have civilian democratic control. On the other, we have military control, and in the middle, we have different degrees. This also raises the question of how do we define a military regime, right? This is sometimes confusing, and that's why it's important to clarify this point. How can we classify a certain regime as being military? Here scholars suggested basically 4 criteria, right? In order to judge not only whether the regime is military or civilian, but also to evaluate progress to what extent is the regime moving from being military to being a civilian regime. Yeah. So the first very obvious criteria is obviously the nature of the ruling elite, right? If the ruling elite, i.e., president, the different ministers, the governors, the heads of important economic institutions. So all these senior political and economic positions, are they actually being held by figures coming from the army, coming from the military establishment, or coming from the different civilian institutions, political parties, civil society organizations, what have you, right? So this is a very clear indicator. Another clear indicator is the way in which this elite came to power. So again, this is obvious. If it is a military leader that came to power through a coup, so we obviously call this a military regime, right? As we said about Mobutu, for instance, right? So we're here speaking about a clear case of a leader who came to power through a coup, right? When you speak again about Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, again, he came to power through staging a coup in 1989, right? So, coming to power, not through free and fair elections, but through a coup, is a clear indicator for judging this regime as being a military regime. But we have also more subtle indicators, like military control over decision making. Does the military dominate decision making by dominating basic state institutions, as we said before, ministerial posts, either directly or through alliance with the bureaucracy? So it may be the case that yes, the military is ruling directly, or it may be in alliance with the civilian government, but it's actually dominating decision making. It's actually designing economic policies, for instance, deciding the major economic policy line, the economic ideology to be applied in the country, and so on and so forth. And lastly, the military's support of the political regime. So if the survival, if the main backing and support and power base of the regime is the military, is the army, so that if the military withdrew its support to this regime, the regime will actually collapse. So this simply means that this regime is more military than civilian, right? Because, as we said, its main support comes from the military, and if this support disappears at any moment, so this regime will collapse. Yeah. If the regime depends on other sources and bases of legitimacy, as we said, came to power through free and fair election, and thus will be supported by other, not only by the people, but even by other civilian forces. So we know well that in countries with strong democratic institutions and rules and so on, when coups are staged, they are being actually condemned not only by the masses who selected this leader in free and fair elections, but even from other opposition political parties, right? That actually refuse, the use of force or the intervention of the military to take over, even if they're not happy with the incumbent regime or with the current political party. But supporting democratic values, supporting the peaceful alternation of power, will actually induce these opposition parties to also condemn any military coup. So again, the point here is, what is the main support base? What is the main source of legitimacy for this regime? Right? Is it popular support or is it military support? So if it is military support, we can consider this to be more military than civilian. And as I said, it's not just either or. It's not that the regime is either military or civilian, but as I said before, it's more of a continuum. Right? On the one hand, we have a regime that either came to power through a military coup, or is basically based on military support, or in which the military totally dominate, decision making and hold senior position, civilian position, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we have a system of, democratic checks on the military and civilians dominating, major positions and so on and so forth. But in most cases, we have, cases in between where, maybe a certain regime in a certain country is moving from one point to the other of the continuum, becoming more military or more civilian, or is lying somewhere on this continuum. But in most cases, we're not in an either or sort of models. The fourth interesting topic is how how did the military rule, right? So now, as we said, in many countries, armies staged coups and were successful to rule African countries after independence for decades. How did they rule? Politically speaking, they dominate power in different forms. So sometimes they rule directly, sometimes, as we said, indirectly. So they may rule through a civilian government, but they try to make sure, of course, not to make this new government connected or linked to the previous regime in any way, or the previous party. So obviously, if they said that, well, we're actually overthrowing this regime or this government because it's a corrupt regime, so it does not make any sense to bring the same figures to rule, right? So they will actually choose other leaders or ministers to rule, but they will remain actually, of course, dominating indirectly. This happened in Algeria in 1965, in Ethiopia after the 1974. It was not the a military council that actually ruled as such, but it was a civilian government chosen by this military leaders. But it may also rule directly, right? So we know that in many cases we had a military council, ruling directly, undertaking the main responsibilities of power, right? So Burkina Faso under Thomas Sankara, when he came to power, he ruled through a military council. Yeah, the major military coups in Nigeria, 1966 and 1979. Again, I mean, this was followed by ruling through military council. Sometimes we have a kind of a mix, and it's interesting to see now what's happening in Sudan, for instance. So in Sudan, as we said, when the uprising started in 2018, and then a few months later, the army took the decision to overthrow Omar al-Bashir because he never got the point that he had to leave. So after different tensions between the civilian leaders of the uprising and the military figures, as you may have been following, the Ethiopians and the African Union intervened to mediate between the two, and the result was an agreement to have, yes, a civilian government, but then there is also what we call a sovereign council, or Majlis al-Siyadi, that you may hear about in the news every now and then, right? That will rule the country from for the transitional period, for the 3 years and a half of the transitional period, from 2019 to 2022. So this sovereign council is, a mix of civilian leaders or civilian figures and military figures. And then the first period is led by the military components, and the second period, 1 year and a half, will be led by the civilian components of this council. So we have here some sort of mix, right? But at the end of the day, of course, there is a clear military component in this council, and a clear military role in the deciding on politics or on general policies. So an interesting point also is to try to assess the developmental policies or the economic policies that were followed by the military in the 4-5 decades after independence. And here we cannot make generalizations. We have different variations in the nature of policies adopted by these regimes. So in some cases we had what we can call revolutionary military regimes. regimes and leaders that actually introduced radical policies that did not only change the structure of the state, but even the formation of the society and classes and redistributed wealth and so on and so forth. We spoke about the case of Ethiopia after 1974 under Mangistu Haile Mariam, and the major transformation that were introduced to the ownership of land, how land in what was a semi-feudal system in Ethiopia turned to be dominated by the state, and then the state distributed them to smallholders but remained the main owner of all lands in Ethiopia. Egypt under Nasser followed similar policies of redistributing lands and so on, and even nationalization of corporations and companies and so on. Burkina Faso under Sankara, again we mentioned before that he made a revolution in the agriculture sector and focused very much on how Burkina Faso can be self-dependent. He empowered women, he fought corruption, so he was also very progressive in the policies he applied. But then on the other hand, we have what we call caretaker regimes, those military regimes that come to power only to prepare the country for elections. So in the famous case of Suwar al-Dahab in Sudan, he just ruled for a few months to prepare the country for democratic elections and handing power to a civilian rule, and that's why he was very much praised that he was not actually aspiring for dominating power, and that's why he actually was committed to his oath, or to the pledge he made that he will hand power to a civilian government. So here we're speaking about, of course, the regime that ruled only for a short period of time, so we cannot even assess its policies because it just running the country until the civilian government takes over and implements its policies. And between the two we have military regimes that come to power only to introduce gradual changes, or only corrective changes in specific aspects or in specific elements. So in the case of Nigeria, for instance, as we said, the major concern was the ethnic divisions between different political factions and so on. So when the military coup was staged in 1999, it tried to change this character of Nigerian politics, the ethnic-based politics of Nigeria, right? But it did not really, introduce radical changes in how the economy is being run and so on. And again, in general, we cannot make general statements on the performance of military regime, like saying that they were better or they were worse than civilian regimes. We cannot make this statement because it simply differed according to time and sector. But in general, those military regimes that were revolutionary or radical or introduced major changes in the country's economy and performance and so on were quite exceptional. So when we speak about cases like Ethiopia or Burkina Faso or Egypt, these were really exceptional cases. But in most other cases, the same way of running the economy and even the same mistakes were committed by the military regime. So although the military regime, will overthrow the civilian leader, civilian regime, claiming that, because it's mismanaging the economy or it's corrupt or what have you, most of the time, as in the case of Nigeria, for instance, as we will see later, they perform no better than these corrupt, mismanaged regimes. Yeah, and that's why scholars like Turdorf came to the conclusion that there is no difference in general in developmental terms and in developmental performance between military regimes and civilian regimes. You will find continuation of the same problems. These days I'm reading on Sudan before independence and since independence, and you can see that questions like nation state building, for instance, or restructuring the economy, these problems continued under long ruling military regimes. Like we'll come to speak about Sudan later on when we speak about democratic uprisings, but in long-serving military under long-serving military rule, like the period from 1969 to 1985 of Nyerere, and under short-lived democratic regimes like the democratic regime of 1985-86 to 1989, for instance. So the same questions and the same crises and the same problems will actually continue. In some cases, military regimes were more able to implement problematic, tough economic measures, and again, I mean, you can guess that because whereas civilian regimes may be fearful of the popular reactions on the tough economic measures like austerity measures, cutting subsidies, increasing prices, and so on, military regimes, because they are basically use force, they may be actually more eager to implement these problematic economic measures. An example of how the performance will differ among sectors and cases and so on is when we're referring here to the major cases of Nigeria and Ghana. So in Nigeria, the first period of military rule from 66 to 79 witnessed improvement in infrastructure, in manufacturing, and this is because of course this was the first period after independence, so the country actually was in need of this progress in these spheres, and of course it made use of oil wealth, right? So in this sector the performance was better than the agriculture sector because again we're speaking about an economy that is based on rents from the oil sector. Maybe the worst military rule in terms of economic performance, but also in terms of human rights violations, was that one of Sani Abacha, right, between 1993 and 1998. So corruption was rife, and this period was a period of capital outflow in which millions of oil money was actually transformed to foreign bank accounts of Sani Abacha and senior officers. And the issue of recovering this money was debated after his sudden death in 1998. But as a result also of gross human rights violation, sanctions were implemented, but they did not touch the oil sector. But foreign investments in general declined, and this led to an economic crisis. In Ghana, on the contrary, the military regime of Jerry Rawlings in the 1980s was quite popular and implemented policies that favored the peasantry, and that's why he gained a popular base that allowed him to win the first multi-party elections in 1992. So when Ghana, like many other African countries, as we will see later, transformed its system from a one-party system to a multi-party system in the beginning of the 90s, Jerry Rawlings was so popular that he won the first multi-party election. But it's also the case that in some examples, military regimes will actually increase military spending in order to give more privileges to the military, to prevent counter coups, for instance, and this will come at the expense of other economic sectors. Right? So this was the case in Ghana after the 1966 coups. We will find that the military spending increased by about 22%, and this led to a decrease in social services, i.e. education, health, and so on, especially in the countryside, and decreased by about 28%. Right? So one has to look at all these aspects, right, when assessing the performance of the military. The extent to which major economic policies has changed, and as we said, it was only in exceptional cases that radical transformations happened. The extent to which the military will tend to increase military spending at the expense of other sectors, and what sectors of the economy was, attracted the attention and attracting the importance of the military to invest in compared to other sectors. The last point for today is what we call military withdrawal, and maybe the concept of withdrawal itself is not accurate, because as we will see when we speak about civil-military relations, in many countries with strong military domination over politics, like the cases of Nigeria, for instance, the military never actually withdrew. But the question here is, well, if in the period from the 1960s to the end of the 80s and 90s, the military dominated power either directly or indirectly and refused to hand power voluntarily, what happened after that, right? Even in as we said, I mean, even in this period, while in some cases they rule directly, in other cases, as we mentioned, they will hand power to civilian government in a very short period, but will remain in control. They will remain to dominate politics from behind the scenes. But even after the democratic transformations in the 90s, we found that some military leaders and officers tried to acquire what we call civilian trappings, right? So they said, well, if the game now, if there is a change in the game now, and democracy is the only game in town, as they say, and in order to gain Western support, and also, of course, as we will see when we speak about democracy, in order to face the waves of uprisings and democratic demonstration that we're facing at home, we should transform our systems. So if we have to do that, we can't simply change our trappings and form political parties and hold elections and still dominate in one way or the other. We spoke about Rawlings in Ghana, how he won in the first multi-party election. We'll speak next time about the case of Nigeria. So again, in Nigeria in 1999 with democratic transformation, Olusegun Obasanjo, who used to rule before as a military leader, staging a military coup in the 70s, came to power again, but this time in multi-party elections. The same for Moussa Traoré in Mali in 1979. Now, if you're asking the question again, but are we speaking here about a military regime or a civilian regime? I will ask you to go again and evaluate the 4 criteria that we spoke about, right? Is the military, we should then ask the question, is the military still dominating the basic decisions, designing economic policies, social policies, and so on? Yes or no, or to what extent, right? Is the military basically the basic support of the regime? Yes or no, or to what extent, right? So these are the basic question that we should ask, because it's not as simple as saying, well, by holding elections we are witnessing an automatic shift from a military regime to a civilian regime, right? So I think we now covered much ground about civil-military relations in Africa in the period from the 50s, 60s until the 80s and even the 90s. But as we said, the last 2 decades witnessed a change in the rule of the game, and as we will see later on, democratic transformation started to happen in Africa. How this actually affected the nature of military or civil-military relationships? Did these countries manage actually to change the rules of politics and ensure what we call civilian control and civilian checks and balances on the military? That's what we will actually discuss next time. It may be useful to read not only the recommended readings, which are two readings, one chapter in Turdorf, but also in preparation for next time, uh, reading on civil-military relations and transforming or reforming civil-military relations by a noted scholar, but also to read on the Nigerian experience, which we will discuss in details next time. What went right, what were the successes and failures of reforming civil-military relations in this case. So hope you are, following these lectures as soon as they become available. And if you have any questions, we can even make some sort of pause and try to start next time with any questions you may have on leadership or civil-military relations. If I did not receive any questions from you, so I will simply assume that you're following up and that everything is fine, and we will proceed with our next stage in discussing civil-military relations. Thank you.